Okay, good afternoon, boa tarde, bem-vindos e bem-vindas. Welcome all to our first Brazil Lab event this year on planetary governance perspectives from Brazil. A special hello to people who are following the event on the Brazil Lab YouTube channel. My name is João Bill. I'm a professor and chair of anthropology and the director of the Brazil Lab here at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. We are delighted to organize this event in partnership with the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. And I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the Program in Latin American Studies, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and the Department of Anthropology. We have an absolutely exciting fall colloquium series following today's event. Next Tuesday, we'll have an event called Princeton Terra Indígena, an art exhibition in progress by Denilson Baniwa with Denilson Baniwa himself, an Amazonian indigenous artist in conversation with art curators who are preparing an exhibition of Baniwa's work, engaging early colonial writings, images, and also Amazonian maps from Firestone. And this exhibition will be launched next spring here in Princeton. And then next Wednesday, we have an event. It's a continuation of today's discussion on climate change and Brazil's conservation frontiers with the incredible Tasso Azevedo and the wonderful Brazilian scientist Marina Hirota as a discussant. So stay tuned, stay connected to our social media, and we look forward to having your participation in the forthcoming events as well. It's not Brazil that needs money. It's not Colombia that needs money. It's not Venezuela. It is nature. The Brazilian president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, told journalists on the second day of a major environmental summit in the Amazonian city of Belém last August. If under Jair Bolsonaro, Brazil was an international pariah, under Lula, Brazil is back. And in Lula's own words, we are interested in building a new geopolitics so that people can change the governance of the world. Lula's vision of the global order, quote, based in dialogue, multilateralism, and multipolarity, rejects standard stark divisions and their calls for confrontation. We will have relations with everyone, Lula has also recently stated. We have a remarkable group of scholars to probe what ideas and practices of governance, planetary and otherwise, are emerging from the perspective of Brazil and the global South at a moment when Brazil is at the helm of the G20 and Lula has been making the fight against climate change and inequality an administrative priority, all against the backdrop of a divided country and market fluctuations. So we will start our presentations today with a great friend of the Brazil Lab, Ilona Szabó. She has been with us since the very beginning and at every step. Ilona is a human rights and international studies scholar, a globally recognized civic entrepreneur. Ilona is the co-founder and executive director of Igarapé, a leading think and do tank on security, climate, and development issues in the Global South. Ilona is a member of the high-level advisory board of the United Nations United Nations Secretary General. She's the author of In Defense of Civic Space and Drugs, The Untold Stories, among many other books. We are also delighted to have back, in person, Brian Winter, who has been participating in several events that we have been organizing over the years. Brian is the editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly and one of Latin America's most influential political analysts. He has lived in Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico as a correspondent for Reuters before taking on his current role in New York, where he's also the vice president for policy for the Americas Societies and Council of the Americas. He's the author of several books, including The Accidental President of Brazil, with former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso. And then we have our own Deborah Yashar. She's the Donald Stokes Professor of Public and International Affairs and Director of PIIRS, the Princeton Institute for International Regional Studies. Her scholarship focuses on democracy and authoritarianism, state-making and citizenship, social movements, and ethnic and immigration politics. Her most recent book is titled Homicidal Ecologies, and she has also recently co-edited the book Inclusionary Turns in Latin American Democracy. So we are in for a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And our format today is that Ilona will start. She will present for 15, 20 minutes. Then Brian will make a presentation. And then Deborah will take the podium, offer some comments, remarks, and a question or two. And then Ilona and Brian will respond. And we will open up to a conversation with you all. And we want the conversation to continue over a reception on the back of this room. So let's give Ilona, Brian, and Deborah our warmest welcome.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. Brazil needs all of us here and much, much more. So thank you, Brazil Lab, Professor João, Miqueias. Thank you, Deborah, for PIIRS, how do I say that in an acronym, for hosting us. Very proud of being affiliated to this institute, and I think you're bringing amazing and diverse minds from that quarter of the world that is big enough not to be in the global debate. So Brazil is back. What does that mean? So let's gonna start with a few, I think, for an informed audience, many things that you already know, but hopefully that will trigger the conversation with Brian and all of you. So I would say that we are at a crossroads, and we can decide afterwards if this is true or not. Just going to briefly talk about trends, risks, and vulnerabilities. Also bring a focus in what I call a pact for people and planet, and this window of opportunity that I think it's too short. We have to work for it to be longer than it is today. It has to do with the democracy that Deborah will tell us all about. So very brief. So, of course, Brazil is immersed in a global scenario where we have major unstoppable trends, and I would just name a few. We could name more, but aging, digital transformation, geopolitical tensions, this transition to a multipolar world, and nature and climate disruption. This has different means for different parts of the world, but means that these are trends that are there. We all knew some of these trends were coming, but we most didn't see that they were converging also with other overlapping crises, and be the pandemics, be what we're seeing with the polarization, fall of democracies, and many other issues that are just intersecting with those trends today and making things a bit more complex. And this is also sharpening vulnerabilities, but vulnerabilities are also in the, let's say, in the bottom of many of these crises. So I would just like to tackle the inequalities. And in a moment that we most need countries to cooperate, the tensions that we're living through this, let's say, shifting in the geopolitics is not allowing us to sit at the table. So we're living in a very uncertain moment at a time that we need cooperation at most. So what does this mean to Brazil? So Brazil's population is aging before we actually became, let's say, a rich nation, and that will present issues for like pension, it will present for our health system, but also for productivity, economic development, and we're going to have to face this. What does that mean? We don't have a very skilled labor, so meaning also how to think through education, lifelong education for older people. Lots of different questions that if we had taken opportunity of really improving our educational system and got into the demographic boom, we could be at a better stage now. Brazil is also in the, let's say, a center of the digital transformation and the AI revolution, if we say like that, but it's a very connected country. So we have more cell phones than people in the country. So we have 1.2 per habitant. Most of our population are online. But again, the literacy, the lack of digital literacy is an issue. And when we talk about also the inequalities that are already there, as you know, Brazil is one of the most unequal nations in the world. I saw the latest information on that this week, like 1% of the top holds 48% of the income in the country. So really up there. So it will just bring many, many questions to a very divided and unequal society. Also, when you just face a geopolitical competition, how are we gonna make what João just mentioned possible? That is to have relationship with all countries in the world without compromising all the basic values that we share. So what will Brazil do to navigate the tensions? And I'm gonna come back to that. And it's not gonna be easy. And I think the trade-offs are very serious for the country in the long term if we don't have at least minimum principles that we defend inside and outside of Brazil. We have to be a little bit more coherent with what we're defending inside and outside. And the nature and climate disruption. So here I'll just mention, most of Brazil's cities are in the coastal area. So what it will mean for adaptation, for the most vulnerable people that are already living in very, let's say, improper conditions. And so apart from all the other issues that are raised here in terms of our major assets that we have in terms of nature and actually renewable energy and being a fruit producer, what will be of the people that are in Brazil when shocks and stresses that are already hitting are exacerbated? So there's much beyond the discussions that we have today. There's a just transition discussion that needs to come and happen very fast. So I would like to focus on the climate and just transition trend, just because I think this is let's say that's where we come back to the world. That's our starting point of coming back. So there is a saying by former Minister Isabella Teixeira that says the Amazon puts Brazil in the world, but also takes Brazil out of the world. So I will just focus on that. So preaching to converted, we all know we're going through this triple planetary crisis. So climate disruption, biodiversity loss, pollution, and this has implications for everybody, but we are not in the same ship, as many people like to say. Some of us are really in very, very, let's say, bad boats, wrecked boats, and others are in transatlantic. So how we're gonna equate that? So where to start from the point of view of developing countries? And I'd say Brazil is a messenger of this point of view. So we have to think about common but differentiated responsibilities. We need to really discuss how we're going to pay for this transition, how we're going to put people that are more vulnerable at the center of the policies. But in my view, this does not mean that we don't have to commit as a country, as developing countries, to also do the best we can. Not do the minimum, but do the best we can. And I think that's where the conversation gets a little bit incoherent, and they're going to discuss that. So I also think that this moment of uncertainty, this moment of, let's say, a lot of negotiations and pushback opens space for new forms of thinking, new arrangements, new positioning. And we are yet to be, I think, positioning ourselves less as of a victim, but as a country that can provide a lot of things that the world needs. I think we have to transition also from only complaining to leading. And for that, I see a world that we need more than ever what we call networked multilateralism, because the competition is fierce. We're gonna need to find spaces where we can sit down and talk about our common priorities, about global public goods. And again, here, Brazil could be fundamental in these discussions, in just also turning this multilateral world a more democratic one. And to do this, we're gonna need to bridge across sectors, not only disciplines and levels, but also across sectors. And in diplomacy, this is not so common yet, and I think it has to be. So I was recently involved in crafting a report for the Secretary General. It's called this Breakthrough for People and Planet, where we discuss 4 major issues for multilateralism. And here I would like to focus on what we call the Pact for People and Planet, which basically aligns the treaties for our climate that are already there, but with more targets, with more ambition, like raising the ambition for global climate governance. And why does this matter for Brazil? Because we're trying to do our own pact for people and planet inside there, and that's where I want to bring us. So very briefly, we delivered to the Secretary General in April this year this set of actions, and the idea is that this can inform the discussion in the Summit of the Future that will happen in next September 2024. So this week, next week in New York, we have a first ministerial to prepare for that. There's nothing so innovative here, but what we did along the report was to try to, how do you really integrate the triple planetary crisis framework and actually have goals and targets that are, again, coherent, because there are trade-offs. When you talk about a green energy transition, there are trade-offs potentially with biodiversity, because of land use, because of what we're going to have to do in terms of mining, because of other issues that are out there. And we need to put these issues together, because otherwise, one can jeopardize the other. So the idea is to have very clear targets and very, I would say, comprehensive discussions on how to achieve net zero, how we're going to phase out fossil fuels. This is a discussion that is out there, but where are the dates for that? There are no dates for that, including in Brazil. How we're going to provide energy for people. There are over almost 1 billion people in the world that don't have access to energy, not for the minimum needs, but also not for to power their means of living. We have to be able also to stop deforestation, and there are targets that we're going to talk about how hard are they today, but there is the zero deforestation by 2030 target that is very strong in Brazil's position today. We're proposing a global incentive mechanism to protect standing forest, going beyond carbon credits, also binding targets for biodiversity loss in the global biodiversity framework, nature regeneration, and honestly, how all this can lead to a circular economy, because we need to regain balance between people and planet. And how does this translate to Brazil? So Brazil has many frameworks already in place. We have what we call the Forest Code. We now relaunched our plan to reduce deforestation in the Amazon, what we call this PPCDAM. We now also have a public security plan targeting security in the Amazon, because what we know about deforestation is that the drivers of deforestation are illicit economies. So we have to tackle also environmental crime and converging crimes if we want to reduce deforestation. And now we're crafting what could be, let's say, a plan that puts all these pieces together, what is being called the Ecological Transformation Plan by the Minister of Finance. In my view, this would be our pact for people and planet in Brazil, if we're able to have the right ambition, if we can actually just bring this to be our turning point. And we can, of course, discuss this in details in the conversation. And my fear here, and the questions I want to pose to you, is if we don't have the right ambition, if we only think in short term, and that's the trap for middle-income countries, we won't see what will happen in 10, 20 years. We're not going to position ourselves to be able to graduate from a middle-income country to a high-income country. And why this matters? It matters because not only I'm Brazilian and we're fond of Brazil, but matters because Brazil is a leading country in the G77. Brazil really also has a role model, kind of it plays a lot on what other countries choose to do in the global south. So if we do it wrong, many others, in my view, could also do it wrong. So apart from that, we also are going to have exclusions and more exclusions of the global supply chain and trade agreements if we don't do our, I'd say, homework right. So what's this window of opportunity? So it started for me, in my view, in the Amazon Summit that we just had in August in Belém. Of course, November this year, first December, we assumed the G20 presidency. Then we have the BRICS presidency, and we have the COP30 in the Amazon in Belém in 2025. And our, let's say, world leadership by Brazil, of course, happens in a context of many other world summits and events that also are major because we are, for example, this week entering the SDG. We're midterm to the SDGs, and we all know we're not doing well. So we're in a very consequential moment if we want to really improve the state of the world, if you want to leave a world for the next generations. And just to save time for Brian, I'm not going to go through everything, but we can talk about the Amazon Summit, what it means. I think the G20, it's an interesting moment because there's a troika of developing countries, and Brazil is coming in the middle of that. We have already a hint that nature and climate and inequalities, poverty, hunger will be at the forefront, but also reform of the multilateral system. And I would invite everyone, let's influence this agenda. There is several space for that. So we are already engaged in the T20 in Brazil. So also the BRICS, and the BRICS are, I would say, the elephant in the room, because now we have an enlarged BRICS. What does that mean for the geopolitics of the world? What does that mean for Brazil that aims to be in good relations with everybody? So the new BRICS, now with this 11 countries to be confirmed, but that's the, let's say, they have some homework to do until January, but I think that's what we're gonna have. So they have just, you know, a piece of information. So 72% of rare earth minerals and 42% of the oil. What does this mean for the green transition, right? So we are also the heads of the new development banks. Like, are we gonna use this presidency to catalyze investments for our green transition? What we're gonna do with that? So for me, it's unclear. I don't think it's Brazil's intention to position as an antagonist to the West, to the G7, but how it will navigate a group of some countries that do want to be the antagonist. So I think this is very tricky, and I hope we can manage that. And we have a lot of homework to do before we have the COP30 in an Amazon city in Belém, not only because the city has to be prepared for that, but because the country has to review our nationally determined contribution, that there was a little, as we call, pedalada, I don't know how to say that in English, by the last government. We have to fix, because we just basically changed the baseline without ever, we have to go back to a baseline. We are still to regulate our carbon market to our own interest. We have to present results from all these plans. Of course, we have to guarantee a just transition. This means how we're going to leverage the resources to do so, leave a legacy for the Amazon, and you know, not only for Belém, engage the population so we can turn. So in my view, it's time to lead by example. And that's not an easy thing when it comes to the picture that we just saw in the first slide. So what are we going to decide? So is the short-term economic needs, and there are many needs for the people in Brazil. For instance, the question of, are we going to drill oil in the Amazon, in the delta of the Amazon or not? So the states that would benefit are very poor states. The people are hoping to have those royalties from the oil. We could question, do royalties then really result in better, let's say, provisions for the people? In many cities in Brazil that are oil producers, no, they don't. So how would we would do better if we did this time in the delta of the Amazon? So also, this is a long-term plan. Is this going to be compatible with Brazil in 10, 20 years? Like, how do we want to position ourselves? Are we going to be the green power in forests, green power in renewables, green power in food production at scale with low carbon emission? We could do all that, but requires leadership. So otherwise, if we don't craft a very ambitious vision and have also, I would say, a moderate level of risk-taking here, we can just continue in the International Division of Labor. We're going to be providing commodities, and that's it. Others will transition, and we're going to continue in our middle-income trap. So we don't have the money, but we do believe that we could actually leverage that. But ambition, in my view, is not there. We have the foundation for that. So we have not only the resources that the world needs to preserve, so here I mean forest, but we also have the resources that the world needs to transition. So again, these are not easy trade-offs. 30% of the non-reserves of strategic minerals are in the Amazon. So, and many more we don't know. That's what we know, right? How we're going to manage that. So this window of opportunity needs to be taken very seriously, but very responsibly, because decisions have to be backed by evidence. So that's why I think we are in this crossroads. So we want to maintain, and as a Brazilian, I want my country to maintain relationships in the world because I think the world needs brokers, the world needs bridges. But can we do that? Leverage investments for the green transition and really develop a sustainable economy without, then it's a question, compromising our democratic values, because also we just passed through a major intent to undermine democracy, and democracy is shaken still, not only in Brazil, and we're going to have to compete, right? And maintain flows of investments and trade. So are we going to be able to do all that? And for me, doing all that without strengthening democracy is impossible, to be debated, but that's my position. And I do believe that we need leaders that actually can navigate all this, that understand these complexities, that can take it on in terms of sophistication. And I see goodwill, but I don't see yet this, let's say, the level of sophistication and coherence that would allow the country to lead, because you have to lead by example. You cannot, say one thing inside and something outside and pretend everything is fine. So my question for the debate is if we're going to be able to escape this middle income trap that we're in, and of course doing all this that we should do in the short term, making the right decisions for us to be in the mid-long term in a different place. And of course, leaving a legacy in the country and the world that is hospitable for the new generations. So thank you so much.
Ok. Boa tarde. Obrigado pelo convite. What an honor to be here. Thank you, Princeton, for the invitation. Thank you, Ilona. It's a privilege to share a space with you once again. Difficult to follow you, but I will try my best. Deborah, thank you for being here as well. João, Miqueias, thank you for your hospitality today. I also want to recognize my daughter Stella is here with me today. She's a junior in high school. And she did a campus tour today, and she would love to talk to all of you about Princeton at the reception. No matter how many times I do this, this idea of being a Brasilianista is a big responsibility. Trying to explain Brazil, especially to a room with so many Brazilians. So I trust, as always, that you will help keep me honest. And if I send, uma bola para fora, I hope that you'll let me know. They've asked me to do a kind of domestic political overview in about 10 minutes or so, which I think is important because, and Ilona, you made a reference to this, before we can really think about what Brazil can do in the world, it's important to understand whether Brazil has the necessary stability at home after all the traumas of recent years. And I've been to Brazil. I'm based in New York. I've traveled to Brazil twice this year. And I have to say, I had two radically different experiences. The first time I was there was in March, and I was in Sao Paulo, Rio, and Brasilia. And when I was in Brasilia, I went inside the Palácio do Planalto, the presidential palace. And this was, at the time, almost exactly 2 months after the failed insurrection of January 8th. And going inside and seeing the shattered glass and seeing the Di Cavalcanti painting that had been stabbed in 7 different places by these pro-Bolsonaro, anti-democracy protesters that were there that day, even though I had seen images of the painting on television and in photos, I have to say that seeing it firsthand was much more emotional than I expected it to be. It really brought home the fact that in some ways what happened in Brazil on January 8th, 2023 was worse than what happened in the United States in Washington on January 6th. All 3 buildings representing the pillars of institutional democracy were invaded and vandalized that day, and it was still fresh. And as a matter of fact, last I heard, they're still talking about keeping that painting. They're thinking about not restoring it so that it can be a testimony to what happened that day. anyway, the other interesting thing about being there at that time was that this was the moment when the stories about what happened, not just on January 8th, but during the Bolsonaro years, the stories about how close Brazil came to disaster, how close it came to some kind of democratic deterioration or rupture, were just starting to come out. And this was a period that we went through in the United States too, and to some extent we're still going through. We're still finding things out about what happened, especially after the period between the 2020 election and when President Biden took office. But I want to briefly tell you two short stories, neither of which have been fully reported, to my knowledge, in the Brazilian press yet, about how close things came during those years. The first is actually not from 2022, but from 2021. Those of you who follow Brazil closely will remember that in March of 2021, the defense minister quit, or he left. It wasn't super clear at the time whether he had been fired or whether he had resigned. And then in rapid succession, the heads of all three branches of the armed forces left as well. And to my understanding, it's never been publicly reported the reason why the defense minister left that day, but I heard from two good Brazilian sources that what happened that day, this was during the second wave of COVID in Brazil. Again, this is early 2021. The governors had closed everything again in most, if not all, of the states. Former President Bolsonaro was very upset about what was happening, in part because he was, let's say, a skeptic of the severity of COVID from the very start. Also, he understood very well what it was doing to the economy and therefore to his reelection prospects. And what I was told was that at that moment, Bolsonaro gave the order for what he called estado de emergência do bem, which is difficult to translate. It's like a state of emergency for good. And the idea was that they were going to send the military out in the streets in order to guarantee the free circulation of people, in order to guarantee that shops and other services would remain open and let the economy run. So he was doing this in direct contravention of the Constitution, basically. He was trying to undermine the authority to order those closures, which is in Brazil's system, that's the responsibility of the governors. The defense minister, my understanding is that he refused and quit, and therefore protocol dictates that the three heads of the branches of the armed forces also quit. This produced a huge scandal. People like me wrote articles that said, I don't want to overstate my role, but I wrote an article, the headline, the next day, the headline was, "An insecure Bolsonaro prepares for his own January 6th. Others wrote similar things. And it seems, and this part I don't know for sure, but it seems that after that, president retreated, and the idea with the new military leadership and the new defense minister that was not broached, and they sort of moved on. The second story I want to tell you is much later, and in some ways it's shorter but more worrying. This was in August 2022, a couple of weeks before the first round of the election. And most of this actually was reported in the Financial Times in an article that came out a couple of weeks ago. But that night, the three new branches of the armed forces met with civilian leaders and the head of the Navy. This was reported in the Financial Times. The head of the Navy issued a threat and said, and I'm paraphrasing, but the tenor of the conversation was, he said, we believe that the election has been rigged. We believe that the electronic voting system is not reliable. And if you do not agree to move to paper ballots, we will take, quote unquote, radical measures. That's the phrase that was but it left me, hearing these stories and a couple others when I was there, left me with this sense of how fragile things had been, and perhaps how fragile they still were. This was also a point where Lula had been in office for 2 months and his popularity was starting to decline. And there were real fears of governability and kind of what it all meant. And I left worried and wrote a piece for America's Quarterly that reflected those concerns. so that was the first trip. Well, I was just back there a month ago. So 5 months later, not that much time. And I have to say, it felt like a different country. Brazil seemed almost normal again. Lula then and now has an approval rating of about 60%. And, this is hard to describe sometimes, but it was a country that felt, I want to hear you on this because we haven't really talked about this yet today, but it was a country that felt somewhat demobilized compared to just a couple of months before. Nobody really wanted to talk about politics. And I had my usual set of meetings. I go and I talk to people on the street. I talk to political leaders. I talk to business leaders. I have a padaria in Moca that I like to go to in Sao Paulo to try to get, these little sort of touch points to get a feel for kind of what's going on. And my sense was that, people weren't really happy. Okay. It wasn't like, wow, things are going so well, but nobody was really, people were kind of, people complain the world over, right? But not in that really polarized way that was so common for so many years. And I tried to understand why while I was there, and I came away with 3 explanations. The first one is that the economy has gotten a lot better this year. The expectation when the year began was that there would only be growth of about 0.7% this year. That was the average forecast of economists tracked by the central bank. And that number, that expectation for this year now looks somewhere near 3%. So that's growth that's like 3% isn't great, but it feels real good for a country where incomes have been stagnant for the last 10 years. And people notice the difference. Inflation is also down. I think it's at 4 right now. A year ago, it was at 10. And the economy has been helped by several factors. I would cite a great harvest. Nothing like a good harvest, especially in a country that depends on commodities exports as much as Brazil does. It's also worth noting that Argentina is in the midst of a 50-year drought. And so that has helped Brazil because it's pushed up prices for its agricultural exports. Inflation has also come down in part because of the central bank that Lula has spent most of his term very publicly and very personally criticizing, but the results are sort of there for everybody to see. So I said there were 3 reasons that I saw for this kind of normalization. That's the economy is the first one. The second is the troubles of former President Bolsonaro. I'm sure everybody in here is aware of the various legal cases that he's facing. This one that involves everybody, the jewelry. It's almost, I have to say, as someone who's been following Brazil for more than 20 years, I find it like it's a challenge to describe this case because it sounds made up. But, he received, for those who don't know, I don't know, not everybody in here is Brazilian, so I'll just very quickly, he received, the presidency received gifts of jewelry and watches from the Saudi government, from MBS, not directly, but that was who it was from. And Bolsonaro allegedly gave the order for those gifts, which belong to the Brazilian government, to be liquidated so that he could end up with the cash. And they ended up in pawn shops in New York and Miami. It's the craziest story. But they got caught. In part, again, talking about Brazilian institutions, they got caught because a customs official at the airport in Sao Paulo said, nope, this is not allowed. And then they brought all kinds of political pressure to bear upon this person. People like, I think 3 or 4, the documentation shows that on 3 or 4 occasions, important looking people came to try to convince the Alfândega that they had to, or maybe it was Receita Federal, that they had to give over the jewels. And they said, no, that's against the law. I'm not going to do it. And as a result, that's why this came to light. Bolsonaro, of course, I will note, being a good, sort of former reporter, Bolsonaro denies wrongdoing, says that he did nothing wrong. But this case is moving forward, and it could result in him going to jail, probably not soon, but at least in the short term, it has resulted in great political embarrassment. And that plus this court ruling that was made that stripped his eligibility from running for president again in 2026, has effectively sidelined him and left, I think it's fair to say, the conservative, the Bolsonarista, more than conservative, the Bolsonarista media space has just been, I think it's fair to say, stunned into silence. And it's part of the reason why the country doesn't feel as mobilized as it did. And then the third reason, Lula. Look, you can disagree with his policies, but he knows how to govern. And some of it is not always pretty. He has used the power of the federal budget to, what's the polite word? I'm sorry? To encourage the Centrão, which is the big bloc in Congress that, sometimes allies with whoever is in power. He's done the same with the military, somewhat controversially. It may not be the right strategy over the medium term, but as Ilona noted, there's the short term and the medium term. And I think the Lula government could be forgiven in many areas for thinking short term, considering what a grave situation the country was in not so long ago. So I think for that reason, there's a degree of institutional stability in Brasilia right now. And I wrote this in a recent article that it feels more stable right now. It could be tentative, but at this moment, that institutional stability in Brasilia feels stronger than it has since the protests broke out in 2013. It's a low bar when you consider where the country's been, but Brasilia feels normal in a way as well. So look, the framework for today is planetary governance, which is to say, Brazil in the world, and we can and will talk about what all this means for the relationship with the United States, for the Amazon, for this idea of active non-alignment that you referenced and João referenced in his initial remarks. Lula's foreign policy, obviously there's statements that have worried people, not just in Washington, but in places like Santiago de Chile, Buenos Aires, Brussels, so on. But the bottom line for me is that this return of domestic almost normal was a precondition for Brazil being an active player again in the domestic space or in the international space. And for me, just very personally, as an American, there's a certain stability that I see right now that may be passing, but based on what we see at this moment, there's a stability that I'm somewhat envious of because, here in the U.S., I worry that we've got another crisis ahead of us. But for the moment, again, I think a relative optimism for Brazil. So with that, what do we do now? Do we, Deborah? Okay. Thank you.
Here? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see you. I want to make a few welcoming remarks, and then I have the very complicated task of not only following these fantastic speakers, but in real time coming up with comments based on these presentations. So first off, I really want to welcome Ilona and Brian to Princeton. It's great to see you and to see you in person rather than just on Zoom. And it's been remarkable not only to follow your careers and things that you've said, but also to be able to converse with you again in real time. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I'm going to say more shortly about your comments, but thank you, thank you, thank you. Secondly, I just want to thank the Brazil Lab for making this opportunity possible, and in particular, João and Miqueas for bringing us here together, not just today, but for the many years of building up these conversations about Brazil, but Brazil in comparative and global context, both to think about these issues of planetary governance and the environment, amongst many other issues. So again, we cannot thank you enough for that. So what I'm going to do today, and João, please tell me if I go beyond my time, I'm just going to make a few comments, pulling out some themes that were raised in the presentations, and then I think I have, I can't read my handwriting, either 5 or 6 comments that I jotted down, some for each of you, some that I hope will open up a conversation, not all of which you'll be able to answer, but you can pick and choose. So the first is, obviously, we have met many times in this room over the last many years talking about Brazil. And one of the things that gives me great pleasure is the last time I was here a year ago, we were really concerned just about the stability of democracy itself. It was prior to the election. We were all anticipating what might happen, not only the election itself, but in the aftermath of the election. And so it's really striking to me, almost exactly a year since that last time, that we can be in this space talking about democracy on different terms with some optimism, as was noted by both of our speakers, and in particular Bryant's comments at the end about a sense that institutions have held, even if fragile, a sense that democracy is moving forward, even if uncertain. So that's the first thing I want to note, is how much the conversation has changed in a year alone. The second is really both João and Ilona's comments that Brazil really has the opportunity, is poised to be a real leader at this moment. We've always said that, and if you're a scholar of Brazil, or you're from Brazil, or you study Brazil, or you love Brazil, or some combination of all these things, there's always a sense that Brazil has always had so many opportunities, but it has real institutional global opportunities. And that's something that really came home in the comments as we think about the G20 BRIC, the COP30, and the like. There really is a different moment, and that's something for us to give pause to. Third comment I want to make is about the anxieties of democracy that Ilona referred to. And this is a phrase that really comes from the Social Science Research Council and Ira Katznelson when he was then president, which is of the council, which is that there is a real challenge for democratic regimes in and of themselves, because we elect in politicians who have a 2-year term, they have a 4-year term, they might have a 6-year term. That's part of what liberal electoral democracy is about. But we're also faced with thematic issues that take more than 2 years, 4 years, and 6 years. So there's a real time inconsistency that democracies present, which is to respond in real time to electorate demands, and yet to have deep underlying concerns that transcend an electoral cycle, and an electoral cycle where politicians are elected, and then they're oftentimes acting to get reelected independent of what maybe the underlying goals are. That's an anxiety of democracy that's really been put to at the forefront, especially when we talk about climate change, and especially when we think about democratic stability issues. So I wanted to highlight that in particular, this time inconsistency, and all the more so coming out of a situation of incredible polarization, a situation of rising populisms that have meant many things over these many decades, but in recent years really have been seen as a threat to democracy, and anxieties of democracy where information itself is itself being questioned all the time. We're in a context where we have these information bubbles as we think about political elections, as we think about climate change, as we think about all kinds of issues. So that was the second thing for me that came out of this conversation, is anxieties of democracy in Brazil, but in general. And the third, to state the obvious, and I'm a political scientist, is that it's all about the trade-offs. Both of these talks were highlighting that no matter what you might think is the end goal, each end goal itself generates trade-offs of how do you respond in real time to demands of people who are living in the forest, with underlying goals that might be raising other people's concerns, and to think about those trade-offs. So those are just 3 themes I want to pull out. And I think what I want to do now is to just pose some questions that came from the talks themselves that I throw back to both of you, but I'll refer to each of you a little bit in the comments. So the first is that this is a talk entitled, or a panel entitled, Planetary Governance. So my first question is to think about the global context within which we are operating right now, and in particular for the comments. So if we look at the global level, and as we've talked about in this room before in other seminars, and we'll be talking about tomorrow in another seminar, we're living at a global moment where there's been the rise of autocratization, right? We're talking about how to create alliances and create coalitions and work in the G20 and work through other kinds of international agencies. But we really need to think about the fact that the states who are in those international agencies are of all different kinds of regime types. It is a moment of increasing autocratization, not just of individual countries, but where the largest countries are themselves oftentimes autocratic. And so the majority of the world's, let me say it in a different way, we have an increasing part of the world's population who are living under autocracies. There's also war that has disrupted all kinds of supply chains and alliances. So to the two of you, I want to ask the question, how does this global context shape your understanding of the kind of planetary governance that can happen both for climate change and for democracy at the very moment where democracy itself has been under strain? And I was going to put another little example, big example in, is also at a moment where we really don't know what the US elections will bring to bear, right? So minor detail, huge detail, right? So the global context is one which is really challenging. It's not just what's happening within Brazil, but on a global level, it's been a huge issue. So how do the two of you think about that, given the themes that frame this panel itself? Secondly, especially for Ilona, I want to ask you, or I want to invite you to elaborate a little bit more about how we should think about the political trade-offs that you highlighted, particularly for indigenous communities who live in the Amazon, relative to some of the other needs that you raised. I'm in a perfect world where we could project for the future, all good things would move in the same direction. But how should we think about the trade-offs, since those moments of tension can disrupt? How do we move that forward? Third question is, what kind of learning is happening across cases? And in a way, this is for both of you. Ilona, you talked about this, the need to think about planetary governance and for Brazil to lead, and for all these, the need for ambition to match not only capacity, but actions and the like. So who should we learn from? And how can Brazil be an example where we learn the right things? You were highlighting the risks about making the wrong choices, but how do we promote the right kind of learning? And for Brian, sort of similarly for democracy and democratic stability, a lot of our conversations were previously about how Bolsonaro and Trump were similar. They were learning from each other and learning from colleagues in Eastern Europe and the like. What kind of learning do you see happening at this particular moment as we think about the aftermath of January 8th in Brazil, or the aftermath of January 6th in the United States? So third, learning. Fourth, I'm a political scientist, so of course I have to come back to institutions, which Brian noted. But both of you have highlighted the need to create institutions, or institutions broadly defined, to strengthen institutions broadly defined. And what I mean by that is not just the courts and militaries, et cetera, but institutions of alliances that mean something, where rules and norms are actually followed. I think here I really want to ask the two of you, what is the question I really want to ask the two of you? I think the question I want to ask for Ilona is, how do you scale up for those multilateral institutions that you started with to build the trust and to build the commitment at the same time that you highlighted you might be saying something differently at the domestic level? And for Brian, in terms of institutions, I think it's fascinating what you observed over the last year, both the fragility of those institutions, the demobilization and disengagement that we see now. Footnote, political scientist Huntington might have seen that as a good thing for democracy, but a lot of people would be very concerned about disengagement to defend democracy. But how do we think about building up and strengthening those institutions going forward? All right, last two comments, really one comment and then just a throwaway. The last one is maybe a celebration and a cautionary note. I think the celebration is to be able to say there was an election last year. Lula won that election. Lula was able to take office. As you noted, he has a vision to go forward, although we want to think about how to harness it. He has a vision going forward, as Ilona noted, and he has support, as Brian noted as well. The cautionary note is, politics is not of one person. And so the more we think of politics as being the politics of one person, we're losing the democratic side of how you think about building up the parties and organizations and institutions that need to support Lula in real time and that can survive him once he leaves office. And so I guess I want to hear a little bit more about who else besides Lula is part of this game in a moment where the PT itself has been so weakened, or maybe it's strengthened in the last year, but has been so weakened. How do we get beyond the sort of cult of a person, even though there's much to celebrate here? I think the final thing is just an observation, which is there were so many fascinating things, both optimism and caution, that you both highlighted. And so I just end with a note that it's fascinating that you both highlighted how ambition is coupled with a kind of institutional stability, how you harness that going forward. I think both of you have highlighted that's the real trick. And there I'm going to end. Thank you.
While you walk, you assemble your thoughts. Deborah, join the sketch here.
It's Brian's? Okay. Okay.
I will not show you. Just move the chair.
You're not going to sit down,
No. I'm gonna sit down.
So I'm going to sit here, but the question should obviously go
Absolutely,
for the
absolutely.
speakers.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. Wow, that was a master class of listening intently
Oh, yes.
and thinking with. Thank you, thank you. So who wants to get started?
Ilona does.
Ilona,
Wow.
okay.
So let me see how long we have, because I want to also have a conversation with you. But Deborah teased so many issues that are super important. So I'm just like going to choose some here. And then we go back when the questions come. I can say one of the things that keep me up at night is the rise of autocracies worldwide. And I think this is a question that many people are posing, how we're going to provide to people what they need, how we're going to meet the basic needs of people. So we actually meet the underlying conditions why people are actually leaning into accepting autocracy as a given in many places. When there will be I just had a glimpse in actually a survey that will be released by OSF on democracy in the world. Like, it's going to be released this week. And we already had this data, part of this data from Latin America. So what worries me most is that the declining trust in democracies by young people. It's not they don't understand democracy. It's basically they don't see what's in for them yet. And this is quite worrying as somebody that, I'm older than most of you here. But I didn't leave the dictatorship in Brazil like as let's say, a thinking being. I lived part of it as a human being, but I live this moment now, and for me, it was really scary to see how fast a country can flip. So 20 years in civil society, working hand in hand with leaders and disagreeing, discussing, but from day to night to be shut totally down from any table on, let's say, the executive power level, and then with effects cascading down, was like something that we could not, like, whoa. We knew the risk, but it was much faster and much easier than we thought. So when I think about our challenges in the climate front, I do believe that this is the issue that will allow us, has to allow us, because it's a survival issue, to build multilateralism back. And because everyone is in the boat, different boats, but everyone is in the boat. So the reason why in my career I'm turning to this issue now is because I think this is a defining issue for all the others. Mm-hmm. So there is also a tension with this issue and the issues that the developing countries want to bring. So this week, this tension is very clear at the UN. The SDGs are the focus of the G77, and climate and just like a green transition is more the focus, let's say, of the rich nations, just to simplify. And I don't think we can do one without the other. We're trying to bridge. So I'm part, of a process that is trying to revigorate multilateralism that would just culminate in the summit of the future. I do think there is a very big need for that thinking. It's like would be, let's say, Guterres, a UN that is weakened but needs to be stronger, trying to say we need a new moment, a San Francisco back, like when in 1945 there was the creation of the UN. We had a pact there, so we need the pact for the future, and that would be the moment. So the thing is, climate is not even in the scope of the summit of the future because the G77 didn't want to put climate there. There is sustainable development. So one of the roles of my board is to say why this is not there. This has to be there because this is the issue that actually north, south, west, east, everyone is in. And who doubts, see the climate stress and shocks, see what's happening in the world today. Like just pick a geography from Libya to Greece to the south of Brazil, pick and choose what's happening everywhere. So I think we have to really build back through issues that are everyone's issues. And although the SDGs are everyone's issues, people feel it differently. And I think the climate with a just transition lens will help us, but we're going to need a lot of negotiation. And if we fail there, I don't see any other issue uniting us in the short term. The nuclear issue should, but it doesn't, because again, we're going to power play, but should. But I think that's the only other, let's say, of course, catastrophic issue that next day, nobody would be here, and we were never so close of a nuclear incident, like since the last one that was actually, a disaster to the world. So I would say that's the only other issue that could unite, and we have to struggle for climate to bring multilateralism back, to be worked towards. Not easy, but I think that's the issue. So in terms of trade-offs, and I think you picked, so my personal opinion is we cannot think about the short term because we can actually, as a country, negotiate the short term because we have what we call so we have the foundation to negotiate funds for the people that are in need and to provide for the people, if we want, with the lens of a leapfrogging in a green transition. We can do that. So I would not, if I was, holding the pen, I would not drill oil in the Amazon Delta, period. Because I don't think this is a trade-off that is going to be good for those people there. Because I know what's happening in the other cities, and I see the inequality, I see the poverty. It didn't actually improve the lives of people. But I think this is a given. I think the president wants that. And I think that will be a very critical decision that can dismantle parts of the government that will not bend for that. I hope not. I would love to be wrong here, but I do think that this will happen. And in my view, again, that's the connection to the future. Because when I think about the way Brazil is betting, for example, on biofuels, yes, we have biofuels, but will citizens be willing to buy an ethanol vehicle rather than an electric one when we're inundated by electric, a combustion engine? And so what will be the choice? So are we in tune with the future? So I think the leaders have to ask this question. They're not asking. They're very linked to the status quo because that's the world they see. And there's a generational problem in Brazilian leadership. And to your question of what's next, Brazil's leaders across the board did not prepare the next generations. They have a lot of people that are loyal to them, which is different from preparing new leaders. So I prepare generations of people that answer the command. And I've been telling to the young generation, are you going to break with your masters? Are you going to break with your masters? Because your masters sometimes are out of touch with the future here. And they can be excellent for the moment, much better than, but it's not good enough. Where's the ambition? Where's the coherence? Because right now we're going to be pressed to be coherent. We cannot say on the 7th of September inside Brazil, democracy, 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 and say what we're saying outside about, or even inside, Maduro, Ortega, Putin, and China, and everything else. Like, we can't say that. We just faced a major intent again. So, and does not mean that we have to break all the relationships with these countries, but this means that we have to be principled, at least, on the baseline of the democratic values, because that's the message that I'm not seeing inside and outside, and that bothers me as a Brazilian. So a lot, because I think this is very dangerous for the world, very dangerous for the young people that are looking at the leaders that we have. So we are in trouble because there are no new leaders prepared or tested or trained by this generation of older leaders across the board to be the next ones. There are young people that are coming, but Brian pushed me back on that.
Well, I was just going to say, no, I don't think, where are the young people in the United States too? And by young, I mean 65.
Phew.
And why is that?
Why is that?
Power has and then to conclude and pass to Brian, because otherwise we're not, and I'll go back to your questions when I listen to all of you. But I think the problem and what's the tricky part of democracy, because even if it's electoral cycles, people don't want to actually conceive power. Power has the blue mosquinha azul fly that beats you when you're in power. We say we have this term in Brazil, which is a blue fly, and I think this is worldwide. But I do believe that we need to train then a new generation to understand that serving at a government is not necessarily a long-term career in a way. So I would say, oh, you're too technocratic. You're like sounding like a very boring, moderate, evidence-based government. Man, that honestly, I think we would need that. And the only way to enchant then a population is, to your point, to have a group of people that they admire, not one. I really don't like the myths, the legends, the man, that model is very dangerous. But that's how, especially in Latin America, not only, but it's been our history. So for me, the thinking for the future, I would really say anybody that would present credentials would have to present a group of people that are actually like, this is who I'm going to govern with. And do you back these people? Because otherwise, we are then negotiating, taking out a minister of sports, a woman that was, a super athlete, by a guy that I never heard of. And the credentials are not anything close to being a minister and delivering what he should deliver. So I just don't think that we're preparing the next generation for that. And there's an educational component. But I think there's a societal component, because to the point that Brian said, we're demobilized, and we are demobilized, and for two reasons. First, part of us are exhausted because these last years we were 24/7 fighting back and trying to protect like the minimum conditions, not to everything that you worked for 20 years in one day out with a decree. So it was very hard. People are exhausted, people are burned out, and so there is this component. But the second is that we actually, as a group of, I would say, elite group, we are used to think about ourselves a lot in Brazil. It's a country that inequality doesn't bother many, violence doesn't bother the elite. I mean, they don't deal with problems that they can buy solutions, or at least pretend to buy solutions. I buy my healthcare, I buy my private education, I buy my private guards or my armored cars, and I live well, and I have my inequality working in my kind of, let's say, my favor in Brazil. And I think this is a very short-sighted, of course, but that's our failure. And the day after the election, for example, we built a program on civic space. There's no more funding for civic space. We monitored everything that happened in the last 4 years in terms of intents. We developed a typology, and this program is shut down. Period. There's no more problem with democracy. And we will continue doing the work, but I cannot have it totally as and we still have problems. And democracy, as we understand now much better, is never consolidated. It's a daily practice, right? And so there's like one group in Brazil, one institution, when let's say to my knowledge, that still has some kind of work on those lines, but the rest demobilized. And that's the threat. People go back to normal. And economy, of course, is important, but should not be the only focus, as we learned. As you know, so I'll continue building on the young people, but the democratic issue for me is how to enchant the next generation, and to make them understand with history that democracy is actually our best bet, and that keeps me awake. To be honest, I don't have the right. I'll come back next year with a better response to that. And hear from you what you think about this.
I'll try to be really brief so we have time for questions. This challenge of planetary governance at a time of increasing autocracy is so not only important, but it's, I think if we're honest and humble, it's really difficult for every country to navigate right now. And to build a little bit, and maybe just around the edges, disagree a little bit, just a little bit, with what Ilona was saying. It's a time not only of increasing autocracy, but war, and it's difficult for Brazil. There are trade-offs, as you were saying earlier, and I think Brazil has opted in practice for kind of a middle path in a way that at least hypothetically makes sense. China now receives, I think, last time I checked the data, either 2 or 3 times as many exports as the United States does, but the U.S. remains by far the biggest investor in Brazil. This agro boom that has kind of saved, in some ways, Lula's approval rating, and therefore brought a certain democratic stability back. How is this agricultural boom possible? Thanks to Russian fertilizer. It's true. Without that, it wouldn't have happened this year. And so, there's clear interests there. And I think in theory, it is possible to have a strong democracy at home and still have constructive relationships with dictatorships and with governments that are really abhorrent in many ways. And the classic example, of course, in the United States is the relationship, not so much now, but historically, with Saudi Arabia. But in practice, it's really difficult because, you look at Lula's comments about, assigning equal responsibility for the war in Ukraine to, he said that Putin and Zelensky were equally culpable. He received Maduro in Brasilia, not only like for this summit, which seemed defensible, but gave him honors that were akin to a state visit, and then stood on stage and said, oh, the only problem Venezuela has is a narrative problem. And then said in an interview, I think 2 weeks later, said, well, democracy is relative for you and me. And to me, humbly, that's the difference with the United States, is that, to my knowledge, no U.S. president ever stood on a stage with a Saudi ruler and said that Saudi Arabia is really a democracy. I wrote at one point, the damage that these comments caused, not only in Washington, but in places like in Chile and Argentina, was considerable, and I think undermines some of these other questions that we've been talking about today. It really damaged Brazil's reputation. And one question that I get a lot, as somebody who humbly tries to help people here in the United States understand Brazil, this question that I've received so many times in the last 6 months is Lula anti-American? And my short answer to that is probably not, but he is anti-US hegemony. And I think that in fairness, what he's really interested in is not so much, I think it's partly this stance that he's taken is not just interest-based, but it's based in this belief that China and Russia can be used as tools to loosen that US grip on sort of this unipolar moment that is clearly changing now, but is slipping away. That quote, João, that you quoted at the beginning, where Lula talked about a new form of global governance, was actually about that. That was on stage in Beijing after questioning the primacy of the US dollar, which again, like, it's perfectly within a sovereign right of a country to do that, but it is a signal, and I think shows that, again, it's not just interest-based. People around the world have been listening, and I've heard this phrase in Washington that Lula is probably best thought of as a partner rather than an ally. Similar things coming out of Brussels. One more thing. You asked so many good questions. Well, I don't know about too many. Beyond our capacity to address them. I want to say something about this challenge of younger politicians, and just give an example of a place where we actually, an imperfect example of where we saw this, and that was Chile, where, of course, we saw this new generation of former student leaders who 12 years ago were leading protests against the government, and then Gabriel Boric, at age 35, gets elected president now almost 18 months ago. And look, it's a government, I said it's an imperfect example. Boric's popularity is somewhere in the high 20s. Things have not gone great. But one thing that I find super interesting is, to your point, Boric was actually two things. Boric was part of a group. There were 4 of them. And the reason why Boric was elected was because he was the only one on election day 2021 that was 35. Yeah. Boric came in and was really criticized, and actually it didn't, one of the reasons I think that things have not gone smoothly for him was he brought there were really 4 of them. Boric, Camila Vallejo, Isquia Siches, and Gregorio Jackson. And all 4 of them all the same age, all in their mid-30s, all occupying like the Interior Ministry, a really important secretariat, and government spokesperson, but like in a super spokesperson sort of role. And that lack of experience hurt them. But part of the reason they did that was because they were a group. They were a core that arrived together, and they did not come out of nowhere. Final thing here. I mean, the idea, oh, wow, there was this attention around the world. How did a 35-year-old become president at a time where we have all these people in their, nearing 80 who seem to have a monopoly on politics? How is it possible? The best answer to that question is that they ran for Congress. They did not try to make the jump directly from civil society or elsewhere. They went in, and Boric was a member of Congress for 7 years, I think, before he was elected president. And so I think, to your point, the more that we can encourage people and get people that age to run for city council, Congress, mayor, all these positions, that's, if there's an answer to this question, that's probably where it comes from.
I'm filled with questions, but let's open to you all. Let's make one round. Let's go for, again, the art of condensation. So
I'm also filled with questions, but I'm struck that in part, a lot of the really innovative and ambitious ideas that were on Ilona's slides are enabled by this non-alignment position that Lula has taken. In effect, by relativizing democracy abroad, Lula seems to be enabling a much broader vision, not just for Brazil, but for many countries in the global south, to really enter into the sphere of planetary governance and perhaps be protagonists for a more, I don't know if a democratic view of planetary governance, but a much broader and multilateral approach to planetary governance, particularly on issues related to the climate, which have historically been in the global governance of the climate, some of the most closed spaces in global governance. So, how do we square that seeming contradiction of, a democratic victory at home, democratic relativization abroad, and that combination enabling a much more ambitious protagonism on climate and planetary governance?
Great. Great.
Jonathan,
One more
Sabia?
question. One more question. Yes, you'll get the mic. Okay. Awesome. Wonderful sum up. Yes.
Thank you. My question is on because Brazil was negotiating a treaty with the EU, and this seems to be stalled right now. And this, in conjunction with the expansion of BRICS, do you think there going to be a moment where Brazil will need maybe to choose a side on that, on whether he can actually create meaningful alliances with more Western countries? And and if there is anything that Brazil can do to avoid to actually have to decide to avoid making BRICS to be such a antagonist role of the more traditional institutions.
And maybe I just squeeze in my question because I always ask you, Ryan, as if you had the crystal ball, right? And the US and the Biden government, what's their role in that move that Ben described?
Mhm.
Go
Wanna
ahead.
start?
No, please.
So you actually touched on something that I think there is this contradiction, but Brazil could be a champion, and I think should be a champion for democratizing the multilateral system. So reforming the UN, reforming the international financial institutions, we're all for it. And on the report I showed there's a lot of meat about this as well, and proposing how this would look like from the Security Council to the boards of the IMF to the World Bank. We do need Southern voices and a totally different representation. And that's, I think, part of the tension the BRICS is being reinforced to kind of face. If you don't allow us to break in, we're going to build our own multilateral system here, and they're going to work with our friends. So I don't think Brazil agrees with that BRICS should really be, let's say, friendshoring, nearshoring, or just, aligning and closing up to the West. The tricky here is, will Brazil, with the democratization of the multilateral system that I also believe the US is for the first time talking more serious about some concessions. Let's see. The world is in a, I would say if there is a time, the time is now. I used to work, for UN security reform back when Brazil was with Lula there, Brazil in the world. And that issue disappeared from my desk for over 10 years. It's back, So I think there is a moment there. But what I'm saying is that I don't think Brazil should trade off our opinion, our position about democracy, even if you're talking in a BRICS forum, because I think it's a different thing. And to fight for really reforming the whole multilateral system is a need for the system to survive. And Brazil is a very important player for that because of the influence on the G77 and the history of the country in the multilateral arena. But I don't think for that it needs to water down its, let's say, pride of being a democratic country. And also because the UN, if you read the UN Charter, the Human Rights Bill, you can't just throw everything out. So Brazil could manage to do, let's say, keep a position and keep the relationship. It could. I just don't think Lula is doing that. And I don't think it's easy. And I think the trade relations and everything that we are dependent on, I understand. But I think there are some principles that we don't sell, especially because of what we just went through right now. And because we're actually in a moment where the young people are totally distrustful or questioning, what is democracy bringing for me? So I think there's a responsibility there. And I think a guy like Lula could do that. Not many people could. He could keep the position and keep friends. He could. So that's my kind of pushback to him, saying, you can do better. You have the credibility in this sense because of your own history to do better. So I also don't think we're going to have a problem with the EU treaty and BRICS. I think we're going to have both. But the EU treaty now, as you know, what Brazil and other developing countries are pushing back is on actually the environmental conditions that were set. And I understand, I don't agree, because I think it's for our own interest to fix the problems that the Europeans are asking us to fix. And from where I am now, I can say I have enough information to say that if we don't fix, and I'm talking about, you know, the whole traceability of supply chains, I'm talking about the responsibility of the human rights protection of the people in the front lines. It's, you know, it's our own failure. We're failing our people. And, you know, we didn't enter this conversation here, but if there is a threat to the Amazon, the threat is called today organized crime. And if there's anybody really pushing back in our sovereignty, it's these groups. It's not anybody wanting to invade the Amazon. You know, we are really in a problem, complex territorial problem with criminal organizations and a lot of informality. And again, it's of our own interest to solve what Europe is asking us to solve. Of course, short term is hard. So push on a transition plan, okay. But don't say those conditions are not the right ones, because they are. So if I was negotiating, I would negotiate a transition and longer kind of timeline, because the issues are very complex, and leverage funds to support the traceability systems, and, you know, even more. We have the Amazon fund, but we need more money to do what is needed to be really able to monitor all the supply chains and to protect the people that are like facing those shocks. So I think we're going to have both, but Brazil should push back on the timeline, not on the issues.
Deborah, a quick remark, and then we'll end with you.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to highlight that this fundamental tension that we just talked about is not peculiar to Brazil. And it's really important to just note that everybody faces the challenge of an international system that is predicated on sovereignty of the state. So everybody in these international organizations has, according to our international system, a right to be there based on sovereignty. And that's the challenge, I think, that's being highlighted here, not whether or not they should be in these international organizations writ large, but then what you do on a more bilateral and smaller level. And I think those points that Ilona highlighted of how you work in these smaller groups, or as Brian said, what you do when you welcome somebody into your country, that's where those tensions, I think, are particularly in play. And so I just wanted to note, it's not just Lula. I think every democratic country faces these challenges when we're negotiating, and to be able to think about how, that's what diplomacy is, how you balance those trade-offs is a really deep ethical challenge. I'll just stop there.
My turn. So many questions. You know, I sometimes wonder if for these conversations, if it's helpful to be a political analyst or a psychoanalyst, because we spend so much time trying to understand these leaders and why they act the way they do. And one way of thinking about this question of international alliances is to maybe revisit this comment that Lula made on stage with Maduro. Why did Lula say that? You know, as somebody who's been following him for a long time, I think it's partly because he sees the world through the lens of class struggle first, and he sees somebody there who is he perceives to be on quote unquote his side. There's some nostalgic connections with the regional left and with Chavez in particular. But it's also because non-alignment makes sense for the reasons that you described. I mean, if you see, again, through the lens of class struggle, you may be willing to set aside some of these democratic values and think of this other, somebody, I forget now who, used the word democratic in the other sense, right? Not in terms of institutional Republican government, but democratic in the sense of more equal, like a more democratic global governance structure. And I understand that. It's consistent also with the most important doctrine of the Brazilian foreign ministry, which has always been self-determination of nations. The question is, how long can it last? And you raised this question of what would Brazil have to choose? Well, all these countries have to choose, and I don't know the answer to that. What I can tell you is that I travel elsewhere in the region. I mean, Brazil's my specialty, but all leaders around Latin America for the last 10 years, whether they're on left or right, it's not an ideological issue. What they say keeps them up at night is this notion that at one point they will have to choose between Washington or Beijing. I don't think that choice is any, I mean, I don't know if that's imminent or not. You could imagine that, for example, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan might be the thing that might cleave the world in two and force countries to sort of make a decision. But until that happens, I think it makes sense for Brazil to pursue this strategy that they're doing right now. I mean, and it's not just him. Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was the president during the 90s and who you mentioned, I helped him write a book. He once recently said, a couple years ago said, with regard to this question, he says, Brazil has to take advantage of our best strategic advantage, which is that Brazil is far. And it makes sense. I mean, again, like that leaves out values sometimes, and it may not be sustainable. But for the moment, part of what's driving this agricultural boom is that countries around the world feel like they can come and invest in Brazil and in specifically commodities. It's the Chinese, it's the Americans, it's the Europeans. By the way, I don't think the Mercosur EU thing's ever going to happen, but we can maybe talk about that. No, I don't. In part because Argentina is going to drop out of Mercosur and destroy Mercosur when Milei wins next month.
Yes,
But that's a
Brian
different.
believes Milei will win. So if we're sleeping well,
But I right now it's not just it's the Europeans, it's the Americans, it's the Chinese. There was this huge Saudi delegation there recently. The UAE was there. In the current status quo, everybody is coming to Brazil and South America generally, in part because that's where the resources they need, but also in part because this neutrality or strategic or active non-alignment or whatever you want to call it is working. It makes countries, these other powers feel like they can come and invest safely in these resources. So, and then the final question, what's Biden's role? What's Biden's role specifically in this non-aligned question? Nothing, I'll just say this, it's short. I've seen over the last 10 years that nothing closes hearts and minds in Latin America faster than a gringo or a U.S. official standing on a stage, wagging a finger and explaining to them why they should not do business with China. And I think, in fact, I'm certain that the Biden people on Latin America understand that. The rhetoric is different. They say, we understand in private. They say, we understand you're going to trade. We understand it's in your interest to do so. Essentially, they understand, again, this reality that for the moment, at least, this active non-alignment, this rise of the global South it's what's happening. And to try to stand in the way of that would be counterproductive. Not everybody in the bureaucracy feels that way. But I think in the White House, I think there's a president who generally speaking understands that. Will there be a president in the White House who's cool with that 18 months from now? That's the other question, but that's for another time.
On this incredibly sobering note, we are so deeply grateful for the dynamic view of this field of planetary governance that you left us with, and like filled with questions, probings about, local, international politics, questions of values, ethics, political mobilization, futurity. It couldn't have been more exciting, sobering, but exciting to think with. And the fields of thought that you opened up to us was just phenomenal. So I can only say to be continued. Thank you, Ilona, Brian, Deborah. Thank you.